Hi, hello everyone. My name is Molemo Moiloa. I am an artist and organizer based in Johannesburg, and I'll be moderating the discussion today. Welcome, thanks for joining us. Today's session is entitled Alternative Possibilities Towards Self-Reliance, and we will be having a discussion with some artists and an economist to engage with this thematic. A big thank you to the organizers of this event. I think we're going to be having a great few days of some really interesting topics and really interesting speakers. The speakers for this session are Third Space, which is made up of João Roxo, who's a designer and visual strategist based in Maputo in Mozambique, as well as Russel Hlongwane, who's a cultural producer based in Durban, South Africa. And they, as Third Space, will be in discussion with James Shikwati, who is an economist based in Nairobi, Kenya, and who is the founder and director of Inter-Region Economic Network, which is a think tank based in Nairobi that focuses on development ideas to enhance the quality of life for Africa. The way today's session is going to work is that we will have, to begin with, a video, which has been produced by Third Space, which will be a kind of sort of starting point for initiating the discussion. João and Russel will then follow that video with a little bit more of a discussion, kind of speaking and expanding on some of the ideas of the video. And then we'll go into a response by Mr. Shikwati, and then we will open up for questions. Please do share your questions either in the YouTube comments or Facebook, and we will be looking to engage with as many of those as possible. If you can, please give your name and place where you're from, but of course, you're also open to comment anonymously. So I think we're going to go ahead with the video now, presented by Third Space, Russel and João.
We are witnesses and active participants of precarious and uncertain, yet electrifying times, where the perimeters of fact and fiction are blurred and often conflated. So blurred, in fact, that rigor becomes hard to attain. We sit on this nexus between our vulgar, frightening reality of ambiguity, while tending to the unimagined and the impossible as means of arriving at the unexpected, bursting wide open the doors to new possibilities. We live in a template culture. As designers, access to information tends to immerse us in a formulaic process, with predefined elements and stock packages at our disposal, constraining the extent of our creativity and forcing a sort of visual uniformity. This standardization is a heritage of modernity, a reflection of coloniality. We are therefore confined, boxed within the grid of Cartesian thinking, or are we? Not everyone has been granted the same access to this template culture and its panoply of tools and access information embedded within it, or the limitations imposed by the MS Words and standard graphic interface software. Necessity is the mother of invention. Living in discomfort leads to creative strategies to confront the high tides and make way for meaningful survival. We live in a makeshift culture, working for and from the bottom of the pyramid. Even though this pyramid is now being questioned and upended, we use it as a temporary framework nonetheless. Here, it is the users themselves taking ownership of design processes and producing what we call speculative outcomes. It is within this context that Third Space is trying to theorize a very particular form of design making. This is our reinterpretation of the speculative. The speculative as an instrument to be used in a productive manner to fashion our own African ontologies through design. From this thought, a new set of politics emerges, one of non-empirical contours, one that acknowledges the supernatural, one that allows for new narratives that sit outside and beyond the Western imposed frame of thought. We would like to draw into focus what we call the design triangle of power, which looks at the territory of intellectual property, mostly in Europe and North America, relating it to the manufactured goods of the same intellectual property in the East, and the selling of these goods in Africa, with short lifespans. This system locks consumers in a perpetual cycle of rebuying, remanufacturing, reshipping, all of which are features of accelerated capitalism. We call upon two parallel pathways of design, or making products for purpose. The one is what we can call the discipline of design, the Western training of design, so to speak. To discipline is to tame. One can think of the grid system, the frame, the Cartesian grid as a prescribed schema within which to think. On the other hand, third space is interested in a taxonomy that works beyond the grid, one that does not concern itself with formulaic schemas of creation and production. It is these devices of imagination we seek to play with, the realm of what they call informal, non-formal, the anti-norm. Terms such as System D, Mkokotelo, Gambiarra, Kanju, or MacGyvering relate to a world of immediate solutions for problems created elsewhere, yet experienced here. Third space arrives as a non-binary plot of dialogue for incubated possibilities.
João and Russell, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, João will pick it up first.
Good afternoon, everyone. Our intention for this segment is to achieve 5 specific aims: to unpack yet not reduce what you have just seen in the video. Secondly, to demonstrate how the examples in the video are emblematic of our practice and preoccupation. Thirdly, to distill what we mean when we speak of the speculative and how that connects to questions of dependency that are so central to this platform. Finally, present some examples of what we think are refusals to dependency. We will do this by way of pointing to communities and ecosystems that have assembled themselves to achieve alternative possibilities under the pressure of a globalized system that seeks to undermine their values.
And here we start. There is a peculiar kind of economic trade that is formulated, politically enforced, and through diplomacy coerced into Africa. It's called aid, packed with its baggage and good intentions. However, just beneath its veneer and its perceived good intentions lies a hyper-lucrative economic model for the benefit of the superpowers, one that foregrounds aid to free trade. As it is well known that with great dependency comes great vulnerability, a vulnerability that is readily assumed by African leaders, yet appended by African subjects. The net result of this equation is a world where aid becomes trade, a world where the accepted narrative enhances the gap between the North and the Southern hemispheres. And so why would we turn to speculative design as a stage on which to address and analyze this dialectic?
For a few reasons. Chief amongst them is that speculative design is inherently critical of global systems and the world of products, in a way that the standard form follows function type design fails to perform.
When we talk of the global systems, we are calling into focus the template of the world as a schema or as an arranged system with its dominant political economy. And then, on the other hand, to think of the products that emerge from the system as political agents. As such, the combination of the arranged system and the emergent products collectively are a departure point from which to discourse about the global order.
In this pursuit, the speculative becomes a thinking tool, a methodology of sorts that we use to work through these questions. Imaging the virality of the memes.
Upon initial engagement with the field of speculative design and a given particular curiosity with the visual barrage of images that are dismissed as LOL or SMH moments on social media and other information outlets, matched by a found design language in our cities, it became clear to us that a reorientation of what we understood as design is well needed, in fact urgent. We therefore started to work with an index of design languages that form part of our lived experience, our mother tongue, if you will.
This form of design comes out of a need to make do, make shift, or make fit. And here enters the political, because perhaps the fundamental difference here is the role of the user in repurposing, adapting, and reconfiguring the piece of set design. In other words, the question here, of course, becomes, why do we have to hack? Why do we have to reconfigure? What faults in the system make it necessary for us to tame products and global systems in order for them to conform to our localized reality? We live with so much excess and yet such little access.
Hacking. Our practice obsesses over the politicization of design products and global systems, where these goods are applied in a radically unique way than for which they were originally designed. So it's fair to say that the most extreme example of the makeshift is as absurd as a global order that deems it necessary.
The nature of our work is in politicizing whilst resisting the temptation to solve. This is because contemporary society is so engulfed by the need to solve, the need to optimize, to enhance, to accelerate, to compound and upscale in pursuit for a solution. Yet some of these existential concerns implore introspection, not for the need to solve, but for the need to bring down systems completely. Why the resistance to solve?
Well, because those who can afford to solve do so. Yet sadly, we find that they don't solve, but rather shift the burden. To whom, you may ask? Well, the burden is shifted to those who don't have the option to shift it any further. Because it's easier to patch and to fix the material world than it is to encounter ourselves and question our humanity. So here's another way to think about this. Who has reaped the fruits from the activities of the Anthropocene? Yet who will pay the price for this?
We haven't quite managed to third space. We haven't quite managed to duck or shield ourselves from what we call the material assault from the global powers. Here, we are referring to surplus goods of aid that arrive in African markets as products ready for trade. In this frame, Africa is something of a material dumping ground, a wasteland of sorts. It is from this position and moment that we look at everyday products as tools to trace and stage global politics.
So these everyday products we speak of range from cheap imports from China with definitively short lifespans across to secondhand clothing that departs European and American shores as aid for Africa and the global South. So speculative design was a starting point after which we realized that this practice is still a niche in many parts of the world, and we were convinced that it applies in a very different way in Africa.
It became absolutely necessary to expand our scope of attention from a purely design investigation towards an investigation that holds various relational fields and creative tension. Our scope is now filled with a growing archive of makeshift situations, insurgent moments of practice, and user-based response tactics to imported goods. These localized responses to design problems and products allowed us to reflect on the dialectic between user and products. Alongside this, we drew our attention to artists, thinkers, writers, spaces, and collectives whom we thought were working in a somewhat speculative approach. They are interested in how things could work better as opposed to things working. In other words, what things could be as opposed to accepting what things are. As a sum up, these agents are proposing a different kind of equity and value making, and this we enjoy thinking through.
So we seek to bring into dialogue a set of practices operating in novel ways within their chosen fields in order to arrive at some productive proposition and possibility for and in Africa. These propositions and possibilities provide evidence that despite and in spite of the tensions in global systems, there still exists micro-narratives that offer methods of assembling ourselves and those things that create value for us as Africans. And so in 2020, why is this continent still perceived as a bag of post-colonies, still framed and theorized through the rubric of development studies, still referred to the proverbial sleeping giants despite its active fieldwork?
Decolonizing design. Probing into the role of technology, design, aesthetics, and visual culture at large, we inevitably find ways to acknowledge existing values and value-making systems that contest the standards imposed by the said status quo. Homi Bhabha, in his book, The Location of Culture from 1994, proposes that, and I quote here, "The theoretical recognition of the split space of enunciation may open the way to conceptualizing an international culture based not on the exoticism of multiculturalism or the diversity of cultures, but on the inscription and articulation of culture's hybridity. It is the in-between space that carries the burden of the meaning of culture, and by exploring this third space, we may elude the politics of polarity and emerge as the others of ourselves." So here, an appeal to a shift of perspective from a vertical hierarchy to a more leveled horizontal interdependency, one that prospers on cooperation and hybridity.
As commonly said, necessity is the mother of invention. And out of the need for innovation, a new creative enterprise is born in various forms of grassroots entrepreneurship. The IMF and the World Bank have long faced the difficulty in measuring the value of the non-formal economy. And this points to an extreme sophistication of a system that is understood most intimately by its constituents. We call it a kind of economic exile or a relief from the imposed globalized system.
Shadow economics, subsistence off the grid. Globalization is crystallized through mapped out global markets and the slow but steady reorientation of borders, closing the gap between nations and homogenizing the economic, cultural, and political strata. A new economy of improvisation emerges, operating sub rosa under the radar of legality or taxation, although complementing rational models, static ideologies, and formalization.
So to this point, according to Robert Neuwirth, this marginalized system represents, open quotes, the growing share of the world's economy, which makes up the underground economy, which as of 2011 has a projected GDP of $10 trillion, close quote. In 2009, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development concluded that close to 1.8 billion people in the world were already active in this field. At this rate, he continues, given its size, Newert says, it makes no sense to talk of development, growth, sustainability, or globalization without reckoning with System D.
Modern-day under-regulated capitalism seems to be increasingly unsustainable in a mobile and entrepreneurial world. People take it as a priority to support their family, putting their relatives through school and creating new job opportunities without any help from the government or aid networks.
Carved by hand, informality and craft as hybrid modes of resistance. In Technological Disobedience, Ernesto Orota tells a story of how a new form of design surfaced in Cuba. We're facing restricted access to international commerce, standardized products' lives were extended. And with this new practice, a people filled with a sense for creativity and enhanced resourcefulness. Open quotes. Within the process of repair, repurposing, and reinvention, three key concepts speak to an elevated degree of subversion. Firstly, reconsidering the industrial objects from an artisan's perspective. Secondly, denying the traditional life cycle of a Western object. And lastly, substituting traditional roles with alternative functions that meet demand at a local level.
Here, the imposition of a political system of regulations and limitations allowed for the birth of new methods and a growing appetite for problem solving. Similarly, still in Cuba, due to governmental restrictions imposed on internet access, ordinary entrepreneurs came up with the ingenious solution of creating the paquete semanal, or weekly package in English, offline libraries that are shared and spread across the country through portable physical storage devices such as hard disks, flash drives, and memory cards, as obsolete as these may seem sometimes. While to most people in the world, the uncensored World Wide Web is common sense, present-day Cubans are forced to trailblaze their way through their own reality, looking for alternatives to feed a certain fear of missing out on information in all world affairs.
These politics of design, so to speak, are more specific to, although not limited to, the South. In South Africa, for example, Fong Kong is a derogative name given to Chinese ripoffs of famous brands. Although labeled fake, these products have evolved and their manufacturers have improved on functionalities which respond to specific demands at a local level. Due to network limitations in other countries, cell phones surfaced in the local markets with dual SIM card capability. Again, solutions spurred from necessity, born out of contextual, practical limitations. In informal markets, brands like Hugo Boss, Hugo spelled with a double G, Boss spelled with a double O and double S, Chanelly, the double N and an LY at the end, Nokia, spelled Nokkya, Damsong, and Apple, spelled Apel. These brands bring you products that, although are uncertified, show increasingly better quality and performance in an act of market disobedience, unlike the one described above.
In order to understand these diverse forms that design takes and the contextual reasons which make it diverse, we need to think about the design process, acknowledging and embracing hybridity rather than attempting to control or eliminate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, João and Russell. That was really great. A lot of food for thought. I think a really interesting response. I'm struck very much by the very strong sort of so-called global South kind of tendency and tonality to the work, and I think a major challenge to a lot of the ideas we have about design in broad. We're now going to turn to Mr. James Shikwati, who will be giving a response. Over to you, James.
Yeah, these are brilliant thoughts from our panelists. I think it really creates food for thought for Africa and Africans. And but I'd like to start probably by disagreeing a little bit. You know, I think I like what the artists have done to make us rethink. But I think if you look at history and if you look at how the world works, we cannot ignore the fact that despite all the challenges, it all boils down to what I call the free human mind. You know, the Africans too have this mind, and they can always create their own possibilities without necessarily having to follow what is happening in what you refer to as the global schema. And I think we've got already lessons that we can see. If you look at world powers, how they rise and fade, you know, you'll always see that there's always that possibility. There's no power that dominates forever. And that to me gives Africa hope that all we need to do to use at least the design, speculative design thought process is to study how the world works and ask ourselves, what makes the powerful powerful? What makes the weak weak? And then we come up with a strategy, although I see you sort of say we shouldn't come up with solutions, but I think the world operates almost like military. You have to have an objective and have strategy and have tactics and have purpose and have objective. You know, without that, then it's all but a dream that has not been dreamed, and therefore you can never achieve it. And I think I would like to say this from the background of probably the fact of what holds us back. First, and maybe that's why you came up with these brilliant thoughts. First is that Africa thrives on borrowed economic strategies. I like your introduction about aid. So you notice whoever gives you the money determines the kind of strategy or policy you come up with. And a lot of the policies we have favor multinational companies. And that indirectly addresses your point of why we have informality. So informality, as much as it might appear to be rebellion or resistance, it's actually just a breathing space that comes out of the fact that we are suffocated by the donor who determines the kind of public policy. Secondly, if you look at our politics, everybody claims to be democratic, and therefore they develop development strategies based on elections. So if you always have elections after every 5 years, the president wants to achieve whatever they call development, quote unquote, within the 5 years so that they can be re-elected. Now, if we compare with the schema you talked about, the arranged system, the arranged system has to think beyond 50 to 100 years. But if you have a country that thinks about 5 years of election, you know, we can blame the international system, but the issue is really pegging our development to our five-year electoral cycle, which in my view really is the biggest shortcoming in Africa. But generally, I like the presentation in the sense that you capture really the issues that Africans go through as exporters of raw materials, as importers of goods, to the extent that we ignore our own indigenous foods, we ignore our own indigenous crops, which is a powerhouse for industrialization. We ignore our own arts, you know, music, you know, what I call the creative art. We ignore it because everybody wants to mimic other countries. So this is quite powerful, and I like your emphasis of people should repurpose their lives, and I think this is a challenge to all individual Africans. I think we should not wait for government, we should not wait for for some international person to think for us. I think each one can do what they can do as artists, as business people, and also as politicians to stop thinking about the 5-year electoral cycle. And probably lastly, so that maybe we open this up for further conversation, you've noticed across all 54 African countries, there's a sector, I'll use a Swahili word, jua kali. It's an informal sector. I think Indians call it jugat. You'll get an African who can fix a Mercedes-Benz car, but he has never been to school. You'll get an African who will put up a building, but he's never been to any construction training. You'll get one who will even draw for you architectural design. He's never been to that. He'll be an electrician, a plumber. There's something about this Juakali mindset. What I mean by that is the ability to actually mimic what is happening elsewhere and deliver to the perfection. In my view, this already gives us the possibility of upgrade. And that's why I would rather go for optimization. I'd go for scaling up. I'll go for competitiveness as opposed to simply giving up and saying, you know what, people, well, let's not come up with solutions. I mean, if you see what's happening when people are dying of hunger, when people are dying of malaria, we need solutions. So we need to optimize to make sure that we fix these problems. I mean, in East Africa here, we're having a challenge of locusts. And don't forget, we've got even the challenge of COVID, corona. You've seen what Africans have done, develop their own masks. They're not waiting for somebody to bring them those medical masks. So all this, I think, is something we need to tap into and see how best we can, in my view, positivize the energies of capital to develop some possibilities in that manner. The next conversation of speculative design, it will be maybe China and Europe complaining about the African people having surpassed what they do, because don't forget, we've managed to survive colonialism, we've managed to survive slave trade, and we are resilient, and it tells you that there's something special about the African people. But the crying, too much crying, saps our energies away from focusing long-term. And remember, those who dominate because they think long-term. So maybe I can let the moderator allow us to have further discussion on this. Thank you.
Thanks, James, and thank you for the brief response. It gives us a lot of time to chat, so this is great. I think we have to start with a response from Russel and João about this question of solutions. You need to explain yourselves.
All right. And if you don't mind, there's maybe 4 points that I'd like to address that Mr. James Shikwati has raised. So the first point is to perhaps clarify the notion of the position that we take of not obsessing over solution. I think part of that, I mean, we are sometimes so obsessed and taken by speed, by the need to resolve things and have the answers. And I think at this point, what we're trying to do is to set a number of really critical and sharp-edged questions that, through responding to those, lead us to a very productive and fertile point from which some solutions can emerge. For example, aid in itself is kind of a bandage. Yeah, it's this perpetual solution mode that is supposed to be temporary, but eventually becomes permanent in some way. So that's kind of the response that I would offer to the point of not being solutions driven. It's not at all what we say. And then to talk about speculative design, for us, we started as in the narrative or in the recital, we spoke that we started in the area of speculative design, but it became apparent to us that we actually are approaching a much broader field of speculative approaches and speculative practices that can be in conversation with each other. So what could be speculative approaches to economics? What could be speculative approaches to medicine or indigenous forms of healing? What could be speculative approaches to organizing and so on? And so for us, the non-formal economy and the goods contained in the non-formal economy are very, very beautiful, or they're very apt in capturing how these approaches already exist and are in front of our eyes. And then lastly, when you talk about the dual-Kali model, so when we talk about mimicking, I think the framing the framing and the vocabulary sometimes in itself is problematic because it undermines the value of the practice. And what we're proposing is not to look at this mechanic who can fix a Mercedes-Benz without going to a university, but it's to build a vocabulary that acknowledges and affords value in what he does without needing to refer and use a point of reference or to use Europe as a point of reference for what it does. Yeah. So there's almost, again, like the solution for us is it's to push back against the solution and constantly ask more questions. And from that, perhaps some solutions emerge more naturally. João, do you want to make...
Can I respond to Russell before we go to...
Yeah, and then I think we'll get a response from João as well.
Yeah. Let me just make a quick one.
Go ahead.
I think, Russell, you raised very powerful points there. I think my push here is agency, because if you put the agency in the African person, then I think even this aid discourse will just vanish. But I think when aid takes agency away from the African person, or from the target, that's why the issue has to keep coming up again and again. And then the second point I just wanted to raise quickly is if we have to be rebellious, from the examples you gave of Nokia and others, then it has to be intelligent. Because notice the examples you're giving, it's the Chinese who are rebelling against the West by creating these interesting look-alike brands to penetrate the market. And now the West is actually crying about China at the moment. So if we can make it intelligent, fine. And lastly, of course, I agree with you. We don't need to peg it on the European standards. Thank you.
For those of us who are not design people, I mean, my understanding is that the kind of broader global discourse of design and how it's grown over the last couple of years is very much about solutions. And it's very much about solving problems. So what does it mean to make this challenge? Yeah.
Sure. I guess the design conversation is global, right? And the approaches to design, of course, vary a lot. I mean, design is all around us, you know. So when we speak of design and we use design or speculative design, and also the approach to speculative knowledges, you know, we wanna keep it open at that, and kind of open our eyes to what's around us and what kind of influences everything has in us, you know. And in that sense, you know, it makes us think and be critical about what we receive and what we consume and so on and so forth. I'd like to maybe go a little bit back also to respond to the James's proposition, also in questioning of this the aspect of agency, right? And it made me also think of something that always comes back to my mind, which is, you know, someone once, you know, we spoke about this thing of fishing, and, you know, like, you're not gonna, would you rather do? Would you rather give someone fish, or would you teach them to fish and give them, you know, a fishing rod, right? So in that sense, I think it's a lot about how, you know, we find these expressions of resilience, you know, in our ways of dealing with things, and find new ways of finding those solutions and solving those problems, you know. So this is kind of a third space is kind of a waiting room, you know. It's not it's a non-binary space in that sense, because it lets us engage in dialogue, and it is in its essence a provocative sense. Also, the example of China comes in, you know. It's funny you mentioned James, because, you know, the image that comes in the video also of we don't see the Chinese production, you know, in itself of fake as that ingenious solution or that resilience, but what we do with it. So, for example, here in Maputo, we have the second-hand clothing situation, which we're all familiar with. And at one point, it started with aid, but then, you get all sorts of people identifying that structure of the clothing bale and replicating it. So you have people from all over the world doing it, and you have a extreme economic tension between them. Informally, it's acting in the shadow in that sense. And at one point, the Chinese, I think they noticed that, and they started bringing the same bales, which bear the same form, which is kind of trying to also, it's a metaphor for trying to formalize something that is informal, which is kind of like scraps of clothes, and they started selling the same format as products in and of course, this all has an impact in those families and ancestries of people who worked with clothes and, worked with fashion and so on and so forth. So this is more. I don't want to extend myself too much, also to pass the word. But there's, I think, a lot more to say about this, definitely.
Can I just make a comment to Yao's point?
Okay. Yes.
Yeah. I think my response would be that first we need just to look at our culture, because our culture is there's the imported one, and there's what I would say the one running in our DNA, which means the indigenous culture that is not imported. And I think the question here would be, how much do we celebrate failure? Because again, to succeed, you have to be failing a lot of the times, right? So in terms of culture, I think there could be an issue where the fear of failure makes it difficult for us to proactively move to the next step. And the example you give of China, they seem not to fear failure. That's why they can even put a bridge that will collapse tomorrow, and then they'll say, sorry, let's fix it again, right? But then on our side, we want to say, okay, let's be as perfect as Europe, as perfect as the United States, and then we do nothing, okay? So I think the point would be to look at our culture. How do we celebrate failure? How do we encourage? Because I recall I did some work on indigenous games of strategy, African games of strategy. There's a lot to learn, and you'll notice in the indigenous games of strategy, Africans were training their young girls, their young boys, failure. How do you manage fail? And then how do you then progress to be successful? So I think it's something I would challenge the artists to, as we continue with this conversation and beyond, please input the African indigenous games of strategy, and you'll be shocked that we don't need to cry at all.
Just like to say, please do share the study on African.
I can share, yes, no problem.
I think many people will be interested in it. Russel?
Yeah, I think you raise a very, very interesting and important points there, James. In the video, we talk about the need for design to fashion African or a design approach that is premised and based on African ontologies. And I think what we're referring to there is to, when you talk of the schema and the system of operating, somehow the values, our indigenous values and folklore and foreways have to be embedded in that system. That system has to emerge out of those values and fundamentals. Yeah. And so somehow there's a challenge to people who design, make things, and those who sets the infrastructure, who sets the templates, who set the schema for those things to happen. Those two need to connect somehow. And what we're proposing, we're in conversation with you as an economist, and we're artists, yeah? And ideally we'd have a policymaker. And so once we can start to kind of cross-pollinate and talk across these fields and sectors, again, interested and invested in an indigenous perspective, I think something starts to emerge there. Again, it's about asking the question. So I really appreciate the idea that you've just proposed right now, which is around, foregrounding indigenous practices and forms of knowledge making.
Thanks, Russ. Just a reminder reminder to everyone who is tuning in that we are taking questions. There are a couple of questions already coming through. Please do add your name and where you're from if you are willing, and just put them in the comment section of the videos. I have some questions before we move to everybody else's questions, and I'd like to sort of come to you, James, where you've kind of mentioned this idea of sort of African games of strategy, but you've also spoken quite a lot about not working from borrowed economic policies. And of course, this is something that's emerging quite a lot in economic theory, is the fact that what works is clearly not the same everywhere. And you've mentioned sort of the need for optimization, scaling up, I think is another word you meant. What does that even begin to look like? I mean, in some of the work that you've done, I think Russel and João have given us an example of a kind of small scale modeled version of that. But what does that look at economic scale?
Okay, first of all, maybe I start by giving you what motivated some of the work we do here. And I go back to the story of games of strategy. If you look at Chinese, they're using their game Go, the board game. If you analyze how China is approaching the world, be it in politics, be it in economics, in business, is the game of surround until the opponent just gives up. They don't fight headlong. You compare with the Western guys, they use chess. They look for the king. Once you knock out the king, the game is over, right? Now, we go back to our indigenous games of strategy. So you notice if we don't have a game that guides our mindset of how we approach our sense of purpose here on planet Earth, then we end up, as the artist pointed out, playing the schema of others. And you know, if it's their game, they know the rules, they can shift them anytime, you'll never win, you know? But if we create our own game, elevate it to sophistication, then it makes it easier, even in negotiation. But in terms of examples, what we are doing here at Interregion Economic Network, we, first of all, came up with what we call the Young Innovators in Agribusiness platform. And we noticed that young people have a lot of ideas, a lot of technological exposure. So we give them a platform every year, competition. We are for solutions, unfortunately for my artists. So we actually push our East African young people to identify a need, a problem that they see in their community and come up with a solution that can be scaled up. Secondly, we also looked at the power of culture as an engine for transformation. And we've been focusing on African foods. You notice a lot of urban foods are foods from cuisines and recipes from other countries. When you start having your urban population consuming chips and stuff from Europe, you are killing the farmer in the rural area. And then when you kill the farmer in the rural area, you're creating the burden of getting the people in the rural area always asking people in the urban area, please send us some money, help us. And then maybe for those who are based in Europe, you start asking all the time, send us some remittances, you know what I mean? So we are looking at the power of indigenous foods to catalyze industrialization that everybody's thinking about. Many people think it will be only through minerals, but it starts with food. I mean, if you look at our culture, a lot of relationships are mentioned in terms of food, even marriage. Some words for marriage is like cooking for somebody, you know? So we've looked at that, and if you modify it and you create a value chain out of it, you'll be surprised. You need logistics, movement, you'll need markets, the digital platforms will come into place, and you'll need storage, you'll need houses. So all this is how you start catalyzing industrialization on the basis of what is indigenous locally. So we are so motivated on this. And then the last point I'd like to give, which excites me a lot, and that's part of the reason I gave the example of games of strategy. This came out of Thought Leadership Forum. We brought together a bunch of professors and told them, please look at the indigenous games of strategy and tell us how it can apply in military, apply in diplomacy, apply in business, apply in politics, and make a presentation. Please don't quote books from Europe. We told them like that. And we locked them in a hotel in Kampala for 3 days. And what came out was amazing. The power is right here. So that's why I'm so excited with what the artists say, repurposing what we have is where we should be going. Instead of looking out there, we simply repurpose what we have and make sure that we energize it. And I go for solution. I don't fear solution, and optimize.
Thanks, James. One of the questions that's coming up from a few people actually is around the visuals that were screened while Russel and João were speaking. They're asking what the dark stars are about. We had similar questions the other day. If you can chat a bit about that, and maybe also speak a little bit to the use of memes and the idea of memification as part of the space of kind of speculative design and experimentation and this kind of lull effect, as Russel mentioned. I mean, why the use of memes? What does that mean for kind of the digital space from the African continent? João, do you want
maybe I should.
You want to go first?
Maybe I can go ahead first.
Yeah.
With the graphics, just basically it was we wanted to have something present while we spoke, and we found an aesthetic that came out of that, and basically the interaction of the audio just is how can I say this, unexpected because it's unique, it's never repeated, so that falls off the grid. So then after that, with the idea of the question or surrounding the memes, when we speak of LOL moments or SMH moments, it's when, because usually we find lots of in our feeds or people sharing pictures or ready found pictures of ingenious, what we like to call ingenious solutions for immediate problems. And usually, these are just disconsidered as we say, LOL moments or as a meme, with the amount of information that comes in and such. And from that, connecting to what I said before, it's also to call the attention, because these expressions, it's in these expressions that we may find the metaphor or the drive, to let go of this dependency and be autonomous, which also connects to what James was saying, which I found really interesting, which was that this idea of speaking of fear or something that you can't really grasp, that it might reflect as or be translated as an incapability of doing something, right? It's kind of like a behavior change, right, theory, which explores this idea of like, should we communicate fear or should we communicate motivation and so on and so forth, right? And I guess that what we're trying to make is in finding these expressions and these new narratives to encourage people, definitely, and also to say that these people that we seek to work with, we actually didn't have space or time to also read about that, but within the methodology of the reader and the people that we call to contribute, these are people that fall within a specific idea of like they have certain characteristics, and one of them is definitely their work and their proactiveness, and their be it in the arts or in economics or whatever it would be. And also to say that I'm really amazed at the metaphor that you just created, and this you yourself found this expression of something that connected this idea of the games, and you are telling a story with it, which kind of encourages to find this new narrative. So in that sense, I look forward to having your contribution to our next video.
Thanks, João. Russ, did you want to do a quick response to this as well, or should we the questions are now coming in hard and fast, which is always happens right at the end. So do you want to respond?
Now I'll hold my thought then and maybe address another question.
Cool. So the next question goes to James. It's from Vic Tumwa, based in Washington. And it's a big question, but so I'm going to ask you to try and be very brief about it. Why have regional economic blocs failed to wean Africa out of foreign aid? What needs to be done differently?
Well, I think the answer is quite straightforward. I already mentioned in the opening remarks that we are using borrowed policy frameworks. When somebody gives you aid, then they determine the kind of policy framework you have. So even the regional economic blocs, there has been the question, who is driving these regional economic blocs? Because you notice we have to have our indigenous companies that persuade our governments to come up with regional economic blocs. But now, if you getting a regional economic bloc to simply have goods from China, Europe, US spreading across, then it cannot uplift the continent. And you can see an example in East Africa. Right now, even trucks can move Tanzania to Kenya, Kenya to Uganda, because a lot of this is imported from the coast, moving inward. But you can imagine if this were Kenyan business people, Ugandan, Tanzanian, getting the pressure of movement of the goods, they'll be negotiating with the politicians to say, if people come up with standardized way of, measuring or testing against this pandemic called COVID-19. So, short answer, borrowed policies, failure to domesticate them makes it extremely difficult for the regional economic blocs to uplift Africa.
Thanks, James. That was a very great short answer. Another very big question. A lot of the questions are big questions, but that's probably because it's a big topic. Is it really possible to create an economic system that functions differently from global capitalism? And I think this question is interesting because even though in many ways you, James, and Third Space, I think connect in many ways, this might be the space where you have slightly differing positions, where Third Space is really kind of wanting to introduce some kind of completely radical thinking, but maybe, James, you have a slightly different perspective. So I'm going to ask you to kind of give a very brief response to that in terms of what you think. If you're talking about domestic responses, not using borrowed systems, capitalism is a borrowed system. Yeah. What does that mean? James, do you want to start? And then maybe we'll go to Russell.
Okay. Yeah, I would say it's very possible actually to redesign. And that's why I'm so happy with these artists who are trying to force us to see the possibilities. Number one, you start with the measuring tools. How do you measure success? How do you measure what you call development? You notice in Africa, we are very heavy on what we call social capital. Western countries, not so much on social capital. They are looking at the capital in terms of the finances in the banks, in terms of the kind of buildings you have in a city, and therefore they measure your value. But Africa has a social capital. A lot of the businesses that we talked about in Africa always start with social capital. How trustworthy is somebody, and others are able to to have their input. So I would say, redefining the measuring tools of GDP, of what it means to be successful, puts us already on the path to creating a new economic model, a new economic platform. And I think what I can foresee happening post-corona, what we are calling COVID-19, already there's pressure that we are likely to have a new model emerging out of this very unfortunate situation that the pandemic has created. So the answer is yes.
Very quickly, I would put forward the so-called non-formal economy as I think an infrastructure and a network that has already started to create its own political economy, if you will. However, unfortunately, it's been framed in using very problematic terms and framing. And I think if we were to apply a bit more effort and investment around supporting those structures and creating a value add to those structures, I think it might build up to something really, really considerable and formidable. And I think some of the statistics that are cited in the reading already start to demonstrate the potential and value of it.
Thanks, Russell. I have to say, neither of you sound like you're giving an alternative to capitalism, but we can Maybe, João, I don't know if you want to do a last response before we close off, or you're not really wanting to do the capitalism debate. Your mic is
Sorry,
off.
I was muted. I was saying that, would you mind repeating the question, because I was drifting away with what my peers were saying.
The question is it really possible to create an economic system that functions differently from global capitalism?
Rito, myself, I mean, I'm not the economist here, but I think that it is possible. And I think that, call it speculative or not, I think that we need to, to see if it is possible, we first need to design it, to think about it, to try and again be speculative about it and look for these options. I mean, not think inside the the proverbial box and engage in dialogue and find hybrid solutions for these problems that we face in these such uncertain times. So I mean, I guess I was a bit abstract, but we have here a platform, and that's what we're here to do and discuss.
Thanks.
You know what, Molemo?
Thanks.
Yeah, just to make sure you don't say we didn't address your question nicely, remember, economic models are all a resultant effect of human activity. And so it's just a matter of how we change our activity, our perspectives. And that's why you can notice from what the artists are giving us, it's creating that possibility that you see we are not going to behave the same way. And that's why I brought in the corona aspect. Everybody now is hiding in their little houses, and people are being told 10 meters away from each other. So, the human activity, human behavior as a resultant of several of those kinds of actions, you can't expect the economy to remain the same or the models to remain the same, among other reasons.
Thanks, James. We've kind of reached the end of our session. A big thank you to all three of you for the generosity of your ideas and I think a lot of the thematics that we've touched on are likely to continue over the next few days. I've been told to mention that the next session on reimagining the internet is very likely to touch on some of these topics. So I think we can all continue to be part of those conversations as it goes ahead. It's always really exciting to be part of conversations that bring together a group of people kind of speaking from very practical experience about what some of the solutions for reimagining our contexts can be. Always also very exciting not to have to be having constant kind of comparative conversations with the global north, but rather to try and think through our own ideas. And I think third space, that's really what you offer this. So thank you very much for that. James, I'm hoping that you will share your research, perhaps put it on the website, on your website or something, that we might be able to access the information around indigenous games. Do you think that would be possible?
Okay,
I think
that's my assignment.
Thank you. Homework to do. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Last comment is just to mention that there will be a session this evening at 7:30, which will be both Russel and myself as a kind of continued, much more informal, more sort of participatory, engaged session entitled Thinking Out Loud. You can find out more about it on the Latitude website. A last thank you to everybody for being part of the panel and for all of those of you at home listening in.
And João will be part of the session.
Thanks, everyone.
And
Thank
João,
you.
great.
Yeah.
Thank you for moderating, Molemo.
Absolutely.
Great job.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Molemo, and thanks everyone for.
See you all later.
Okay.
Ciao.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.